Dear audience, welcome to Simania Salon Readings, a platform that I coordinate as part of the activities organized by the Association of Latin American Jewish Studies, known as LAJSA, and to which I invite you to join. My name is Cynthia Gabbay, and I'm a researcher and writer. I currently work at Humboldt University in Berlin, and my research is funded by the German Research Foundation. Today, we gather for the presentation of Gustavo Guzmán's new book, Attitudes of the Chilean Right Toward Jews, from Acceptable Undesirables to Respected Businessmen. Simania, which in Hebrew means bookmarker, was conceived to provide a space to discuss books published in the field of Judeo-Latin American studies or of interest to our discipline, whether recent or long-standing. Before we start with the presentation, I will announce only that our next meeting will take place next month on January 15, and we will present the book by Leonardo Senkman called Ires y Venires, Antología Heteróclita de Escrituras Migrantes Latinoamericanas Judías. I will ask you please to mute yourself, if you don't mind. Thank you. So I will start presenting Gustavo Guzmán, who is an associate researcher at the Latin American Institute of the Free University of Berlin. Gustavo Guzmán holds a PhD in history from Tel Aviv University from 2021, where he wrote a dissertation on Chilean right-wing attitudes towards Jews under the supervision of Professor Raanan Rein, who will present today with us. Dr. Guzmán has published multiple articles on anti-Semitism and Jewish immigration to Chile. He has earned multiple recognitions for his research, including the Robert Wistrich Prize 2017 from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Raoul Wallenberg Award in 2018 from Tel Aviv University. Professor Raanan Rein is the Elias Suraski Professor of Latin American and Spanish History at Tel Aviv University. He is the former Vice President of the university and former President of LAJSA. Member of Argentina's Academia Nacional de la Historia, Rein is the author and editor of more than 50 books. His most recent book is Jewish Self-Defense in South America, Facing Anti-Semitism with a Club in Hand, which we presented a few months ago here in Simania. And that this book was published recently in Spanish as Cachiporras contra Tacuara, Grupos de Autodefensa Judíos en América del Sur, 1960-1975. A Hebrew edition should be published within a few weeks. I don't know, maybe it's already there.
It's already there.
Great. So Valeria Navarro-Rosenblatt teaches contemporary history at Diego Portales University, Chile. She holds a PhD in Latin American history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She researches Jews and politics in Latin America with an emphasis on Chile and Argentina. Her research interests include gender and Jewish Latin American history, memory and state repression from a Jewish perspective, as well as human rights.
Alicia, venga conmigo.
Disculpe, ¿le puedo pedir que silencie su... Ahora voy a buscar yo mismo. Listo. So we will start, please, presenting the book by Gustavo Guzmán with Raanan Rein's words. I just remind you that the title of the book is Attitudes of the Chilean Right Towards Jews, from Acceptable Undesirables to Respected Businessmen. That saw light in Brill University Press last year, 2022. Please, Raanan.
Okay, thank you very much, Cynthia, for your introduction. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to share with you several comments on Dr. Gustavo Guzmán's book. And my pleasure has to do with several factors that you, in fact, mentioned just now. First of all, because It's a pioneering research on a topic that has received only little attention until now. Second, because as you said, it is based on a doctoral dissertation submitted at Tel Aviv University, my alma mater, Gustavo's alma mater. And thirdly, because it was published as volume 14 in the book series Jewish Latin America that I'm editing for Brill. And in parentheses, I can tell you that volume 15 is already in press. Before I refer specifically to the book, I would like to offer a couple of more general remarks having to do with Jewish Latin American historiography. The first has to do with the demographics of Latin American Jewry, because they have inevitably influenced research about the Jewish communities across the continent from Mexico to Chile. Since about 75% of Latin American Jewry lives in either Argentina or Brazil, statistics of Jewish organizations published last year in 2022 refer to 173,000 Jews living in Argentina and 91,000 Jews living in Brazil. Whatever you might think about these statistics, still it's a fact that historical, literary, sociological, and cultural studies research has tended to focus on these two communities of Argentina and of Brazil. At the same time, the experience of smaller communities and sub-communities can shed additional light on various processes of Jewish immigration, of Jewish social integration, as well as on the ebb and flow of ethnic relations. After all, the size of a minority group should not be a criterion for determining the research attention it deserves. So let me only make reference to 2 or 3 examples. We all read Leo Spitzer's study of Jews in the virtually ignored nation of Bolivia, a book that has become a model for the study of ethnicity, diaspora, and memory. As you know, Spitzer, a child of Viennese Jews who immigrated to Bolivia, this exotic South American republic, they moved there in 1939. So Spitzer skillfully combines personal memories, oral history of Central European Jewish refugees and their experiences, and reflections on the nature and relations between history and memory. A couple of other examples might be Alan Wells' book on the Dominican Republic. In the late 1930s, General Rafael Trujillo, the brutal dictator who ruled this republic for many years, for about 30 years, offered to take in 10,000 Jewish refugees, or no, I guess 100,000 Jewish refugees, hoping in this way to improve the image of the Dominican Republic. At the end, only 800 Jewish refugees made it to Sosua, the agricultural colony on the island, but still the book tells the story of individual experiences, of state and institutional power struggles, including actors such as Roosevelt, Trujillo, the Joint Distribution Committee, and the Dominican Republic Settlement Association. If you take a look at Ruth Behar's book on Jewish experiences in Cuba, the book sheds light on the diverse identity components of Jewish Latin Americans in the so-called Pearl of the Antilles, which was maybe the friendliest and most welcoming host country for Jews in the Western Hemisphere, at least until the large exodus following the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And more recently, Enrique Martinez Ruiz has provided insights into the Jewish community's impact on the urban development of Bogota. In the case of Chile, by now, we do have a large number of studies on Jewish experiences, from Günther Bohm's historical exploration of Jewish life in this country to Valeria Navarro-Rosenblatt's studies, for example, on the voices of non-affiliated Jews in Chile, and including Irmtrud Boyaks, or Bojaks, how you pronounce her last name, studies on how German Jewish immigration reshaped the Eastern European Jewish community in Chile. And one has to bear in mind that before 1939, the Jewish community of Chile was very small. We are talking about something like 5,000 Jews living in Chile at the moment. And it was only in the years 1939, 1940 that a fairly large number of Jews, about 12,000 Jewish immigrants, arrived at the shores of Chile. So we do have some important studies of Jewish Chilean experiences. Still, not enough attention has been given to this country and its Jewish citizens. And in this sense, of course, Gustavo's book is a welcome addition. The second general comment that I would like to make has to do with the complicated relations between Jews and right-wing movements, or if you would like, Jews and nationalist movements in Latin America. A few years ago, I attended a talk given by historian Shira Klein in UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. The title of her talk was "Why Italian Jews Liked Fascism." And Klein challenged the common assumption that Jews had to have opposed Mussolini's brutal dictatorship. After all, Jews are supposed to reject nationalist movements unless it is the Jewish national movement, Zionism. And maybe Jews should reject right-wing parties in general. Klein, however, presented a nuanced picture of Jewish Italians' attitudes towards fascism, which included opposition, mild criticism, indifference, and also fervent support of the regime. Until 1938, when the regime adopted anti-Semitic laws, most Italian Jews did not oppose fascism. After all, Italy was their home, their beloved fatherland. Why should they oppose a nationalist movement? And Mussolini's regime brought stability and modernization to Italy, from which the thriving Jewish community could certainly benefit. The narratives of organized Jewish communities in the Americas, North and South, have tended to push into oblivion the support offered by various Jewish groups and individuals to nationalist groups in their countries. This was certainly the case for Argentina. Some of you might know I've written about this myth of all Jews opposing the nationalist movement headed by Juan Domingo Perón in the 1940s and the 1950s. The idea that animosity and reluctance alone characterize the Jewish attitudes towards Argentine nationalism are based on false images of homogeneous ethnic communities. Like other ethnic communities, the Jewish communities of Argentina or of Chile, for that matter, have responded in varied and diverse ways to political parties, governments, and ideologies. A close examination of the reactions to either Allende's government or the Pinochet dictatorship would reveal a nuanced picture depending to a large extent on the degree of ethnic identification and social class. Jewish Latin American historiographies have also overemphasized the importance of 20th century anti-Semitism in shaping Jewish attitudes towards nationalist aspirations, paying more attention to public discourse than to social realities. Anti-Semitism was not the sole dynamic between Jews and non-Jews in the Southern Cone. A flawed counter-argument suggests that Jews were permanent victims, and it ignores their agency and their role in shaping collective identities in their countries. I have often argued that the support for Zionism did not contradict Jewish support for local nationalist movements. On the contrary, Zionist sentiments sometimes boosted sympathy for Argentine or Chilean nationalism. Also, social class considerations might have played an important role, at least as much as ethnic identities, in developing the attitudes of Jews towards the government in power. Perón's promotion of local industries and Pinochet's dictatorship served the interests of many middle and upper middle class Argentines or Chileans. Gustavo Guzmán's book offers, first and foremost, a fascinating discussion of the triangular relationship between the Chilean state, the community of Jewish Chileans, and the state of Israel in the context of the Cold War. One has to take into account that following its establishment in 1948 as a sovereign and independent state, Israel has played a key role in the life of organized Jewish communities and Jewish Latin American groups and individuals, and therefore studying Israel's relations with different countries in this region, but elsewhere as well, is an important part of Jewish Latin American history. This is probably even more evident nowadays due to the war in Gaza. Gustavo offers a bold statement saying that Pinochet had a remarkably positive approach to Jews since the beginning of the dictatorship. By emphasizing some of the idiosyncratic characters of Chilean society and politics in the post-World War II era, Gustavo raises a series of broader questions as to the social integration of Jewish immigrants in Latin America, as to the attitudes of the Catholic establishment and right-wing groups towards a group of immigrants that was not always and not everywhere a desired group of immigrants, and also a group of immigrants that was not always or everywhere considered as white. And I will come back to this topic of whiteness in a couple of minutes. Gustavo warns us not to fall into simplistic traps. He calls us to avoid generalizations or a binary or dichotomic perspectives. Never say the Chilean right holds this or that position. Gustavo maps carefully the various and different groups and parties that have composed such a bloc from the 1930s to the 1980s, looking closely at different groups, political parties, publications, diplomats, priests, politicians, intellectuals, all of them within the political spectrum of the right. He detects a mosaic of attitudes towards Jews. And these attitudes are always conditioned by the ever-changing context, both the domestic context and the international context. If we talk about the 1930s economic depression, if we talk about World War II, or the Cold War, which followed it. Generally speaking, we see, at least in some parts of the right, an evolution from a clear opposition to Jewish immigration in the 1930s, or in the best case, indifference towards Jews, into a position of acceptance of Jews as an integral part of a Chilean society, as a social element that contributes to economic development and to Chile's international standing. While in the 1930s and the 1940s, centrist and left-wing parties and politicians like radicals, socialists, or communists expressed an empathy towards Jews, here we can see an inverse evolution. And nowadays, as Valeria can probably testify, it is difficult even for socialist Zionists to find their place among left-wing Chileans. Avoiding an overemphasis on Jewish particularity, Gustavo also considers attitudes of the Chilean state and Chilean rights towards other ethnic groups. And the comparative perspective is very important. So he also considers groups which were somewhat undesirables at times, such as Chinese immigrants or Arab Palestinian immigrants. Gustavo correctly highlights the fact that extreme right-wing nationalists in Argentina were certainly more anti-Semitic and violently so than their peers in Chile. The Jewish Chilean community has been characterized by a polyphony of voices on different issues. And while there were more than a few supporters of the left-wing parties and or of the Allende government, there were certainly more than a few who supported the military coup against Allende and the Pinochet regime for very many years. The concept of Jewish community itself might be sometimes misleading. A more careful attention should be given to Jews who do not form part of the organized Jewish community and its institutions. Therefore, the pretension of the organized community leaders to speak on behalf of all Jews is often problematic, to say the least. This also brings to light the question of the supposed Jewish solidarity, as we know of cases in which the organized Jewish communities of the Southern Cone, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, did not always make an important effort, I'm trying to be diplomatic, to come to the rescue of leftist, quote unquote, Jews persecuted by the military dictatorship. Jewish Chileans have enjoyed a conspicuous upward mobility and therefore became a privileged minority. Considered as white in Chilean society, in the mestizo society of Chile, many became wealthy and influential people, and as such had an understandable fear of the Allende government and its social and economic policies. The military regime, on the other hand, seemed to promise to defend their class-based interests. In the Cold War international climate, Pinochet's Chile decidedly stood behind the United States. The fact that Israel was an ally of the Americans, and also the belief in the power and the influence of Jews in the US, they certainly pushed the military regime to adopt favorable policies toward local Jewry on the one hand, and toward the Jewish state as well. Unlike in Argentina, Jewish Chileans formed part of Chile's armed forces all along the 20th century. This is an interesting point. And it's important because belonging to the armed forces has a symbolic weight because the armed forces tend to present themselves as the essence of patriotism and sovereignty. So if you become part of the armed forces, it's a way to become an integral part of the nation at large. This was not the case in Argentina, obviously. At the same time, Gustavo points to the difference in the attitudes of the Catholic establishment towards Jews in Chile and in Argentina. And he concludes that in Chile, right-wing priests and right-wing military officers were more concerned with the communists, with quotes or without quotes, than with the Jews. In Argentina, such a distinction hardly existed. Jews and Bolsheviks often seemed to be one and the same. And yet, another difference was that in Chile, again, unlike in Argentina, the accusation of Jews as having a dual or double loyalty was less common. The book includes also references to the cases of Walter Rauf and Manuel Serrano, in which Pinochet seemed to ignore Jewish pressure and concern. If we have time later on, I will refer to these two cases. Another interesting point, again, which I cannot go into at the moment, maybe later on, has to do with the emphasis that Gustavo correctly points to or refers to, and has to do with the sale of weapons which tied Israel tightly to the Pinochet regime. And maybe the last issue or topic that I would like to refer to is the effect that relations with Israel have on the status of Jews in one country or another, in this case, Chile. The organized Jewish communities have had a very strong Zionist identity, and the leadership of these communities has adopted almost automatically the positions of all Israeli governments, regardless of their ideologies. This means that good relations with Israel have a positive impact on local Jews, but it also means that the deterioration of relations with Israel might have a negative impact on local Jews. With the new government of Israel and the current government in Chile, there is a good chance that relations might not prosper, and we certainly we have seen a kind of a deterioration in bilateral relations due to the current war in Gaza. So let me end here. Just say that this is a wonderful book, so congratulations, Gustavo, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Raanan. We will continue with Valeria. Please, Valeria Navarro-Rosenblatt.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Raanan, and thank you, and congratulations, Gustavo, actually, for the book. Though Raanan spoke in English, I want to move to Spanish because I had prepared my thoughts in Spanish. I forgot that it was going to be in Spanish. So I guess that all of us speak Spanish, so there's not going to be a problem. El libro de Gustavo Guzmán es un gran aporte y una gran, quiero decir, innovación en cómo podemos entender la relación del mundo judío chileno con la sociedad chilena en su proceso de integración. Quiero partir no como lo hizo Raanan desde el inicio del libro, sino desde el final, porque hay un elemento que me gustó mucho, es la propuesta que hace al final del libro Gustavo sobre el alosemitismo, en vez de pensar la situación, la visión que tiene la sociedad chilena sobre los judíos como algo antisemita. Y en ese sentido, Gustavo nos propone la definición que hace Zygmunt Bauman de alosemitismo, que se refiere no necesariamente a algo negativo hacia los judíos, sino a posicionar a los judíos como algo diferente. Y que de esa semilla de lo diferente salen las visiones positivas o las visiones negativas. En ese sentido, es algo que podemos observar continuamente o cotidianamente en tanto en la opinión pública como en la política de los gobiernos hacia los judíos. No se lo considera como algo positivo o negativo, sino que se lo considera como algo distinto. En muchas ocasiones, incluso en la actualidad, podemos observar cómo los políticos hablan sobre grupos extranjeros, sobre presencia extranjera, cuando se refiere a la comunidad judía local. Es decir, posicionando a los judíos como si fuera algo externo a los chilenos, siendo que ya somos tercera, cuarta, quinta generación. Esta como cierta ceguera o esta falta de entendimiento sobre lo que es lo judío es algo que Gustavo ha registrado a lo largo de los últimos casi 90 años. Y ahí vuelvo al principio. Cuando Raanan comenta que hay muy poca presencia judía y que eso cambia en los años 30 y que eso también luego permite un acercamiento distinto a los judíos desde la opinión pública y los partidos chilenos, creo que es algo que deberíamos también no solamente abordar, no solamente como parte de los estudios judíos locales, sino como algo de cómo esta visión, esta actitud, este entendimiento de lo judío cambia cuando hay distintos tipos de comunidades locales, cuando cambia la cantidad de judíos que existe en un país. Y en ese sentido yo creo que el caso chileno también es podríamos decirlo, un buen espacio de experimento, no de experimentación, sino de una buena muestra, porque hay un cambio muy claro entre la población judía hasta 1938 y luego a partir del 38 en adelante. Y que hay también un cambio en la visión que los propios judíos tienen de sí mismos. Como el pasar de un indeseable era más posible con población judía de Europa del Este o vamos a decir, del antiguo Imperio Otomano, que población judía que venía de esta zona centroeuropea, que era todavía vista como algo positivo en los propios países de recepción de la migración. Entonces, no es solamente pensar a los judíos como un aporte, sino pensar a los judíos como en esta propia diversidad que tienen los judíos cuando llegan y cuando se integran a los países latinoamericanos. Y en Chile, como caso de estudio, como un núcleo que se ve muy distinto a estas etapas de migración, o se ven muy claras estas etapas de migración, podemos ver cómo se puede ir superponiendo población europea del Este, población turco-otomana, población alemana, centroeuropea, y cómo eso también puede ir cambiando la actitud que tiene la población tanto chilena en general como los miembros de distintos partidos políticos y también los que presentan algún tipo de discriminación antijudía. Y en ese sentido también lo que propone Gustavo, esta idea de que el alosemitismo debería ser el lente a través del cual nos acercamos a la población judía chilena y al desarrollo de su integración, es también relevante, porque si ponemos la visión de lo judío como un elemento que nos está permitiendo entender cuál era la relación no solamente con los judíos como tal, sino con los judíos de ciertos lugares, los judíos alemanes unidos a los prejuicios o a los prejuicios positivos, podríamos decir, de lo que es lo alemán, también nos permite entender mejor la recepción o la relación con los judíos de estos sectores. No es solamente los judíos, sino los judíos de dónde provienen. Y en este sentido, también quiero, en mi punto siguiente, unir la propuesta de Gustavo con estudios actuales que se están realizando sobre la derecha. En los últimos, diría, 6 a 8 años ha habido un resurgimiento del estudio de la derecha en América Latina, en Chile también, en el cual se quiere entender no solamente lo que fue el gobierno de Pinochet en los términos de lo que fue la dictadura, sino que se busca entender cuáles fueron los grupos de apoyo que le dieron respaldo a la dictadura chilena y a las dictaduras latinoamericanas. Estudios como los de Marcelo Casals, que nos hablan sobre los gremios y sobre los grupos profesionales que apoyaron a la dictadura, nos están hablando de un ambiente, de un entorno académico que está entendiendo no solamente la dictadura chilena como un espacio, digamos, de intrusión de lo militar en lo no militar, sino como una alianza, y en los últimos años hemos visto que se está utilizando más este término que es muy común en Argentina como una dictadura cívico-militar. En Chile se hablaba hasta el 2016 solamente de dictadura militar. Al enfatizar en lo cívico, se amplía esta visión sobre quienes apoyaron la dictadura o quienes respaldaron la dictadura. Y en ese entorno es donde también podríamos incluir el trabajo de Gustavo, en el sentido de que existe una diversidad de lo que existió como un apoyo a lo militar, a la dictadura militar. Y en ese sentido, Gustavo nos entrega estos matices, y los matices que desarrolla en su trabajo, que bien mencionó Raanan, cuando dice que estudia cada uno de los grupos cada una de las publicaciones, entender las tendencias políticas existentes dentro de la diversidad de la derecha, también nos permite entender que esta diversidad de la derecha existe también en la diversidad de los judíos y en la diversidad de lo político. Lo político, en este sentido, en el caso chileno, yo siempre digo que la política chilena es más fácil que entender que la argentina, porque tienes derecha e izquierda, izquierdas y derechas diversas, pero que no están marcadas por esta derecha-izquierda, peronismo, derecha-izquierda del peronismo. Entonces eso nos permite como agarrar el fenómeno de una forma un poquito más, vamos a decir, lógica que la política argentina. Y en ese sentido también podemos tener en consideración que los matices de la derecha nos permiten también introducir estos matices de derechas que pueden ser con una tendencia más económica, una tendencia más liberal, una tendencia más tradicionalista, y que dentro de estas matices de la derecha, el antisemitismo o la posición hacia los judíos, en algunos de estos campos de la derecha puede estar más cercana o más fácil de agarrar la herramienta del antisemitismo que otras. Y que incluso derechas más liberales pueden también promover alosemitismo de prejuicios positivos. Pensar, los judíos son buenos para ciertas posturas de negocios, para ciertas acciones, entonces van a ser positivos en la modernización del país. Y eso es lo que yo creo que es un gran aporte del libro de Gustavo. Porque no es pensar a los judíos desde los judíos, es observar a los judíos dentro del entorno chileno, dentro de la diversidad chilena y dentro de cómo lo chileno es también diverso. En ese sentido, creo que, yo estoy esperando la traducción al español, no sé qué va a pasar, Gustavo quizás me va a decir después qué onda, me va a decir cuál es la situación del libro en español, porque creo que va a ser un gran aporte en el sentido de que nos permite diversificar y sacar a nosotros mismos como investigadores de los grandes ideas, que así como que toda la derecha es así, todo el centro es así y toda la izquierda es así. En Argentina nuevamente está más matizado, porque si tenemos izquierda y derecha peronista, izquierda y derecha antiperonista, ya tenemos esta preconcepción de que existe la diversidad dentro de cada una de las líneas políticas. Y creo que eso es algo que puede ser muy interesante para el entendimiento de la política chilena, no solamente de la historia, no solamente de la política, sino de la historia política local, que tendemos a estigmatizar a ciertos sectores. Y esta estigmatización suele observarse en momentos de crisis, en momentos de elecciones también. Así es como podríamos ver que los resultados de los plebiscitos recientes se han visto como derecha-izquierda, un centro casi inexistente, pero que hay profundos matices de qué es lo que está pensando cada una de estas derechas, cada una de estas izquierdas, y también ese centro que a veces se mueve para la izquierda, se mueve para la derecha. Y dentro de este escenario, lo judío también tiene elementos que mencionar o que resaltar. Creo que el libro de Gustavo nos permite ampliar esta visión sobre qué hace la política para grupos minoritarios y cómo los grupos minoritarios, ya sean árabes, chinos, judíos, mapuches, diversidades étnico-nacionales, minorías indígenas locales, como se mantiene esta idea de que hay múltiples identidades y que a veces vamos a sacar, nuestra identidad va a ser primero la étnica, pero en otros casos puede ser la identidad de género, o puede ser una identidad regional, una identidad local, una identidad de clase, como bien dice Raanan, que fue la que se destacó durante el periodo de Allende, y como muy bien explica Gustavo, en un contexto que estamos viendo de que el discurso de la Guerra Fría tuvo una connotación muy particular en, vamos a decir, Chile. Y ahora, en la continuidad de lo que observamos, quizás como algunos legados de la Guerra Fría, pero sin el componente ideológico, podemos también interpretar el posicionamiento de ciertos actores judíos en la actualidad como una herencia de estos posicionamientos tan marcados, pero ahora sin un posicionamiento ideológico tan claro. Ahora quizás con un posicionamiento de clase, con un posicionamiento étnico, que no necesariamente nos permite posicionar a los judíos dentro de la política general, sino que nos permite hacer un análisis desde el matiz de la política judía. No podemos decir, como bien decía Raanan, los grupos representativos hablan por el voto judío, que aquí no existe un voto judío, aquí en Chile. Estamos en Santiago en este momento. Entonces, esta imposibilidad de decir que existe un voto con una denominación religiosa nos permite también entender los matices que identificó Gustavo y cómo continúan en la actualidad. Y creo que he hablado como 15 minutos. Creo que me gustaría dejarle a Gustavo algunas preguntas o algunas ideas. Si es que el único elemento que me genera ruido todavía es el tema de considerar a los judíos blancos, como white. Porque el concepto de whiteness se ha utilizado en Estados Unidos en contextos de lectura de los estudios culturales y de los ethnic studies y de los post-ethnic studies, que son muy peculiares para los Estados Unidos, en que la separación entre lo blanco y lo negro es lo esencial. Y esta idea de categorizar a los judíos como blanco quita elementos de análisis propio del judío, aplana lo que es lo judío, aplana lo que es la diversidad de lo blanco, porque en lo blanco también tienes lo católico, lo protestante, lo irlandés, lo italiano, lo asiático. O sea, cuando se habla de los post-ethnic studies en Estados Unidos, tú tienes que los japoneses ya son blancos, que algunos árabes son blancos, que incluso ciertas personas de la India ya son blancos. Y el que se mantiene en un lugar de opresión puede ser la población negra, sin importar cuán blanco, entre comillas, pueden ser. O sea, sin importar realmente su color de piel. Es un tema mucho más cultural que de pigmentación. Y en ese sentido, yo creo que habiendo observado en profundidad ciertos fenómenos de cómo los estudios de lo blanco o de los grupos étnicos omiten ciertos elementos, no estoy segura si es que es completamente igualable a la realidad latinoamericana. Primero, por lo mismo que tú dices, por el ser mestizo, en que lo mestizo es claramente algo no negativo, como podría ser en los estudios étnicos norteamericanos. Que hay elementos culturales que se mantienen en nuestra región que pueden ser más profundos que que el ser blanco o ser de color. Que los elementos de a qué niveles de asimilación pueden alcanzar los judíos en América Latina. En el caso de Chile, puede que se consiga ser hasta lo más alto de la clase élite económica, pero siempre va a haber un elemento, que en este caso puede ser religión, que los mantiene aparte. Y en ese sentido, yo creo que podríamos buscar qué otro marco conceptual podemos utilizar. En Europa no tengo la impresión de que se ocupe el whiteness como se ocupa en Estados Unidos. Entonces, mi pregunta sería, ¿qué otro marco conceptual podemos utilizar, Gustavo, para esta integración de los judíos? Si sigues creyendo que es el mejor o fue el que utilizaste porque es un elemento importante que hay que considerar, pero que quizás no es el más apropiado para la realidad chilena. Quizás lo utilizaste por el grupo al cual estabas apuntando al escribir el libro en inglés y no en español, o al desarrollarlo en Tel Aviv y no en otra parte. Y creo que por ahí va a ir mi último comentario, porque si no me voy a seguir yendo por las ramas y no te voy a dejar tiempo para responder. Gustavo.
Muchas gracias, Valeria.
Okay. I will switch back to English because it was what we had originally agreed. Well, thank you so much to Valeria and to Professor Rein for their very insightful comments. I would like to start by doing a, little statement. I invited Professor Rein because he was the advisor of my dissertation in Tel Aviv. I've learned a lot from him. Thank you so much, Professor Rein. And I also invited Valeria because Valeria and I, we are colleagues. We have been colleagues for a long time, over a decade and a half, I would say at this point. So we have, grown together in this regard. So I appreciate very much both sets of comments and questions and the like. I would like to say that when I approached Professor Rein, I was a bit scared because of his CV, try to convince him to be my advisor, and also because I came with these non-very original ideas when I approached him originally, in the first moment. So we agreed to do this innovative research about a set of attitudes, right-wing attitudes toward Jews, not only the bad attitudes, not only anti-Semitism. I appreciate very much that because I was starting my stay in Tel Aviv, in Israel. And also it was not only about a diversity of voices, it was also a diversity of contexts. So we went from the 30s to the late 80s, with some gaps in between because, the time is reduced. But I'm very happy with the results of the dissertation that quickly became a book. I feel very privileged in this regard. Okay, so I had planned to go to point to one idea first, but I feel tempted to respond to Valeria and then jump to my previous idea, of course. Yes, well, I think in a certain way, Vale, you respond yourself in a certain way, your question, in that I'm not writing for Chilean readers. I'm not writing for Chilean scholars, and I think you can understand me in that this decision is in a certain ways influenced by a certain degree of frustration. That what you and me have written and researched in Chile, not many scholars pay attention to that. The academic culture is different, it's very complicated. I'm writing for people like we present in this meeting, who are based, most of us, in the Northern Hemisphere now, writing in the German academia, in the Israeli academia, in the American academia, and the Canadian academia. Okay, the discussion, I think, is more fluid, it's more fruitful there in many regards. I attended a lecture here in Berlin 2 or 3 weeks ago about Arab tradesmen in Colombia, and it was some colleague. Of course, he made his best effort, but the discussion was so poor, because of course he said with disdain, the gringos and the ethnic studies of the gringos. It was unbelievable. I'm writing for, I'm trying to do a contribution to a larger debate which has been taking place mainly in the US, but also in Europe and to a certain degree in Israel. So, and that point, I'm responding to this famous book about how the Jews became white in the US, white folks in the US. So what I'm pointing there, and also I'm responding to the book, the seminal book by Jeffrey Lesser of 1995, Welcoming the Undesirables. To be honest, that's the really pioneering work on the 30s and the 40s in this regard. Okay, so yes, maybe in the Chilean context, the word, and actually I say that in my book, the sources, nobody says, let's help this guy because he's white. Nobody uses words. There's another word of Chilean, vocabulary, at least in the 30s. They say this person is respectable. That's why I dubbed them respectable undesirables, because it's like, with some ambiguity, So yes, maybe it's not the best term, but in order to include my research to put it in dialogue with other researchers in the Northern Hemisphere, I think it was the correct decision. But of course, I'm open to rethink about it. Of course, it's part of our job. But now I want to bring it back to what I was planning to say briefly. Of course, we have a short time. My book, I'm proud also because I cover a long distance, a chronological distance, with many sources, many actors. It was a bit exhausting. But honestly, if I read the table of contents of my book, and I try to think as an American historian, German historian, Israeli historian, I think what is really, really interesting is chapter 5 about General Pinochet and the Jews. Why? Because Pinochet is the symbol, the ultimate symbol of Cold War dictatorships in Latin America. He was, he killed a lot of people. He was a thief. It's very, difficult to defend him. Okay. But in the Northern Hemisphere, and we can check this in Philip Sands, the book that he's writing now, in the book of The Strongmen by Ruth Ben-Ghiat, of our friend, our colleague Maxine Lovy in Chile, this idea that according to which anti-Semitism played a key role in the Pinochet dictatorship, and the Jews who sadly died in those periods, was because they were Jewish. And I don't agree with that. I think that my archival research shows that is not accurate, that is wrong. So what is my point here? I think, and now I want to tell you that I'm writing, expanding on the topic now, I'm writing about it. I would say that the case of General Pinochet, remarkably positive attitudes toward Jews on the one hand, and toward the state of Israel on the other, sheds light on the studies of right-wing anti-Semitism in the world. Put differently, so far, we in Latin America, in South America specifically, we absorb, we consume the books on studies on anti-Semitism that are written in Israel, the US, and Germany, but we don't make contributions from the south to the north. For instance, I mean, in this case, I see here Professor Sandra Deutsch. I think that her book on the Las Derechas is one of the few examples in which research about South America reaches some impact, in the discussion of anti-Semitism and the far right in the Northern Hemisphere. But alas, there are other very interesting books. For instance, Daniel Elbovich, Nacionalismo y Antisemitismo en la Argentina, which if it was published in English, I would say it would have a very larger impact. In sum, bottom line, my project here is to, from the experiences of the Chile, but hopefully from the rest of Latin America in the future, to make a contribution to the study of anti-Semitism in the Northern Hemisphere, and to be even more provocative. What the experiences of Latin America shows us and to the Northern Hemisphere is that the experience of Jews in Latin America is significantly different to other experiences in the Northern Hemispheres, in that episodes of anti-Semitic violence, for instance, were very unusual in Chile. Argentina is a different story. We know that. But for Chile, Peru, Bolivia, all the Pacific Ocean area and other lands, I think that we need to develop our own methodological devices to grasp what is the specificity of Jewish experiences in Latin America, and not only to copy, to import what our colleagues in the Northern Hemisphere are doing. That is what I try to do. Some days I am more optimistic about my job, others not that much, but that is what I would like to point out this day. That this was, and I'm finishing with this, one of the things that I learned very much from Professor Rein was how to write history, how to make it attractive, or at least try to make it attractive for the readers. And what I would like to do is that what we write be attractive to the publishers in the Northern Hemisphere. So far we in the Latin American studies are like kind of on the margins of the Jewish studies in the world. But I'm optimistic in this regard. I think we can make our own contribution. Okay, thank you. That is what I have to say.
Thank you, Gustavo. I thought this was the answer to Valeria, but you had other comments. No.
No. That's I try to make it all a response to Valeria, and at the same time to point out what was so to speak. When the best writers in the world, no historian writers, when you read a book, they write another book that you never saw, which is they know what is going to happen, before the final version. I think that for us in Latin America, or we, the historians, we have a certain way to write that is too straightforward, I would say. I've learned from Professor Rein this kind of tell a story to save some secrets, so to say, and go showing it, and always thinking in a reader of the Northern Hemisphere. For instance, my dissertation, I mentioned in a paragraph, the Chilean authorities offered a visa to Stefan Zweig. Stefan Zweig never came to Chile. He went to Brazil and he died there, a very sad story. But I included that in one paragraph because I know, and some colleagues, non-Chilean, non-Latin American colleagues mentioned that to me, like, wow, so interesting, I didn't know that. So my response to Valeria was in a certain way, yes, respond to her answer. At the same time, what was the tenets of, so to speak, of my work. Before I started to writing, I had these kind of ambitious plans on my head. I don't know, maybe I'm mixing too many things at the same time.
Thank you very much. Unless Raanan or Valeria have a response to this comment, we can open also the debate with the public.
Maybe I'll say just a couple of sentences.
Yes.
In response to Valeria's comment about whether the concept of whiteness is or is not relevant to Latin American experiences, etc. It's not just a US thing. Certainly, in European discussions, in European academia, the issue is very present. I had a conversation with a leading scholar in the UK a few weeks ago, and he said something like, being the first brown person to head a certain academic unit in this university, I'm sure that they would not even consider firing me. I mean, the issue is very present in very many ways. And the fact that it's not part of the academic discussions does not mean that it's less relevant. I mean, when I first wrote about ethnic issues in Argentine soccer or football, people said, you're inventing something that never existed. I mean, nobody cared about the ethnicity of one player or another. It only had to do with upward social mobility, with the talent of a player, etc. But we all know, hopefully by now, that the ethnic identity of a player might be very relevant to what's going on in the stadium, not just on the field, sometimes on the field as well. So I wouldn't be deterred or wouldn't hesitate to use these concepts, although they are not popular in academic discussions in the Southern Cone.
Gustavo, Valeria, if you want to react, please feel free.
No, I think I made my point, but I tend to agree with Professor Rein.
I want to hear the public speak questions.
So Rosalie wanted to say something?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'd like to congratulate all the speakers. Raanan, you certainly set the scene with a broad and comprehensive introduction from Latin American perspective or on the whole, and then Valeria and Gustavo tackled the book and Chile. Before I ask the question that I have, I want to make a couple of comments. And since this webinar is hosted by LAJSA, I think it's appropriate to mention the contribution that LAJSA has made and continues to make to academic and Latin American studies. I remember the LAJSA conference in Israel, which preceded the conference that you organized in Jerusalem, and gave all of us an opportunity to become acquainted with Gustavo and with Valeria when they were in the early stages of their academic career. And it gives me enormous pleasure to attend the webinar today and to listen to two LAJSA scholars who have grown and developed so much in the years since those two conferences were held in Israel, and their achievements are certainly worthy of notice. And I wanted to say that for the record. So thank you, LAJSA, for this. Then going now more into the content of the discussion, I think that and especially listening to the continuity in a way, Raanan, from what you stated at the beginning, and how Valeria analyzed Gustavo's book conceptually, I think perhaps the time has come to think in terms of a new paradigm regarding Latin American studies on the whole, I find that it's no longer. It annoys me basically to always have this south-north, north-south confrontation in quotation marks, as it were. And I think that there's a lot more to be gleaned from our academic endeavor if we in fact join forces and think in terms not so much of Latin American studies or American studies or North American studies, but we actually began to think in terms of Americas studies, Americas with an S, that I think it's broader in scope, it unifies both, and somehow I think mitigates in a sense the confrontation, and perhaps we'll find that there's a lot more common language or common paradigms that can be used if we interpret these through this particular prism. And for instance, and Gustavo, you said that you're right from the south to the north. But I think that it's really, to judge from your dialogue today, from the south to the south, or the north to the south. I mean, it's these conceptual differences, I think, might not be relevant anymore, or as relevant as they were in Latin American study, or Jewish Latin American studies, or Latin American studies earlier. And related to this, my question, and sorry that I've taken so long, is to both Valeria and Gustavo, to what degree do you think the way you converse today would differ if you were addressing Chileans in Chile, and if you were discussing these issues with Chileans in Chile, not from Chile, and certainly not from Chile, who were educated or continued their education in the Northern Hemisphere, as you mentioned, Gustavo, but Chileans in Chile, within Chile, from Chile, who have mostly done their studies and continue to do their research in Chile, in terms of language, content, concepts, and so on. Thank you.
Please, Valeria, you go first.
No, I wanted to say that Sandra Maggie-Deutsch wanted to ask something, so maybe we can collect
as you wish, Sandra, if you want to ask your questions. We can hear you.
You are muted.
Okay, yes. First, I would like to, can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great, thank you. First, I would like to congratulate Gustavo. I can't wait to read your book and discuss certain issues with you, so I just can't wait. Okay, my next comment regarding whiteness. I think that let's see, you mentioned people using different terms in Chile that could signify whiteness, such as respectability. And I find the same thing in Argentina. The comment that so this person is well educated or has good manners, or is engaged in agriculture, is working on the land rather than setting up a small business or something like that. I think there are a lot of code words for whiteness, and I think we just have to look for those code words. I also wanted to say that while I can well understand Rosalie's comment, and by the way, nice to see you and other people who I haven't seen in Israel for many years, I understand your comment perfectly well, but I would like to say that I think it's interesting that many Europeanists and even US specialists also assume that the influences always move, the so-called transnationalist influences on thinking always seem to move from the north to the south. And I think they assume that it's one way, and transnationalism is not a one-way exchange. It is a circular exchange. And in my own work on anti-fascism, I find anti-fascism based in Argentina mostly. I find that that is extremely important to keep in account, that people in Argentina, and I'm sure other Latin American countries, are taking these anti-fascist ideas and expressing them in a different way, or finding, making modifications. It's not one-way influence. They are then sending those ideas, and individuals who participate in anti-fascist conferences in Europe in the 1930s, they're sending people to that, and those people are making their contributions. And during the Spanish Civil War and during World War II, people in Latin America are sending aid. Maybe it might not be that significant, but they're sending aid to those places. So we always, I think, have to really explore, not limit ourselves to what the influences from the north to the south might be, but rather the transnational exchanges, the circular movement. And it seems to me, although I'd love to discuss this more with Gustavo, and I hope we have the opportunity sometime, that you are more in that kind of realm as well. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say, and I'd love to hear anybody's responses.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Natasha, would you like to intervene? We can hear you.
We cannot hear you. We cannot hear you.
No, it doesn't work. Okay, Gustavo, would you like to answer?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for the questions from Rosalie and from Professor Deutsch. When it comes to the question of Rosalie, wow, it's like this story to like, the Borges story, when the one who is narrating the story, or Cortázar, goes out from the story, sees himself. Why I'm saying this? Because it's very sad to say this, but these kind of discussions, I'm not sure that we are able to hold these discussions in a serious academic ambience in Chile nowadays, and not only now because of the war in Gaza. I would say in the last years. Okay, there has been, there is a reason why the Center for Jewish Studies of the University of Chile stopped doing joint activities for the broader public, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so. It's very, very difficult. If I speak about this, just imagine I am invited to do a presentation in Chile. I know that the first thing that I'm going to be asked is about Israel and Netanyahu's government, and Zionism as racism, etc., etc. So that's the first thing to say. Okay, but that said, let's imagine that we can actually, talk in a more, calm way. I would say that instead of whiteness in the Chilean context, the emphasis is on class. Okay, that's the main difference. The second difference is that the term ethnicity or ethnic, it's much more related to the indigenous people of Chile. Okay, ethnicity is almost always seen, in relation to Mapuche and other, our peoples, but rarely to the Arabs or Jewish immigrants or Chinese. And that's honestly, that's one of the first things that I felt like attracted by the work of Professor Rein, was that. When I read that like 8 years ago, for me, that was revolutionary. I never thought about it. For me, ethnicity was of the Mapuche, So those two first things I would like to mention. First is the, to not ethnicity, but, try to face it as a sort of study of immigration, the emphasis on class. And the other thing is that in Chile, it would be very different or difficult to do the comparison with the Arab immigrants, okay? Also because of the issue of the conflict, but that's not the only reason. There is only this conservativeness, so to speak, of the historians in Chile, that they are extremely conservative in any sort of, groundbreaking research. They are very, hesitant about that. And on the other hand, I would like to refer to this again about the whiteness issue that Professor Deutsch is pointing out. Yeah, I agree with you, Professor Deutsch. These words in Argentina were very similar about their respectability. Es un señor. Let's help him. Es un señor. They don't say he's white, but he's European, okay? But I'm most interested in this concept that you touched about the circular, exchange of ideas, practices. This is an area which I would like to explore in a deeper way in the future, okay? I haven't explored it enough so far, but I would like to mention one of the findings of Professor Rein in his last book of self-defense is how, let's put the example of Jewish self-defense. There is this kind of, I don't know, the word in English, like a circuito in Spanish, of inter-exchange of people, of advisors, people who go to teach how to defend, how to teach the use of arms. It's not much different to the Hebrew teachers who came to South America at certain points of the 20th century, one time in Buenos Aires, then in Chile, and so on. I think it would be most interesting to explore those inter-exchanges from the south to the north. And I will write it down, and I'm sure it will be a good challenge for the future. So far, I don't have the answer. But thank you very much for your question.
I would like to add something. So in response to Rosalie, there has been a few studies that are dealing with the Americas instead of South America, North America. I can mention you a new book edited by Nerina Wisakovsky on the Jewish progressive cultures in the Americas. And there's another book by Adriana Brodsky and Laura Lipman, who gather sources from all the Americas in different period of time. So those two are a new initiative that is actually closer to what we study here in this part of the world, where there's not North America and South America or Anglo-American, but we talk about America, not even in plural. America, like one continent. And so my students always ask me why some countries say that there are 5 continents and others say there are 6 continents. And I try to explain them the most. I cannot find a really very well explained explanation for them. But adding to what Sandra Deutsch was asking, I think it's a very good point to think about not only South America as receiving point, but also emitting and producing knowledge. And there are not new, but some trends that try to find the global connection between the global South. And that's part of the historiography that has been done about Cold War, for example, Tanya Harmer, who does the Latin American or intra-American Cold War, and she specializes on what happened from Brazil, Chile, Cuba, Argentina, and seeing the responses also, not only from what comes from the outside and what is produced from here. So, for example, one of the things that I recall that it was when I was researching about the experiences of Jews in Chile and Argentina during the dictatorships was that in Argentina, part of the decisions to change the way that local Zionist movements were having towards local processes was that what happened in Chile, where Jewish Zionist youth moved from the Ashomer Zaire towards local leftist movements, was an example of what not to do in Argentina. So we also have a dialogue and movement, and I think that is something that has not been explored on the regional organizations and how the ideas and the decisions move. If we think from organizations like FECELA or the Centro, el Congreso Judío Latinoamericano, and other organizations people move ideas, and in a sense that when something happens in one place, they try to learn from that place and to continue that learning in other places, like what to avoid in one place or another. So I think that that's true. We need to think that of what happens here, not only as a receiving point, but also as producing knowledge. And that's one of the challenges that we have as being historians from the South. Like, in that sense, I appreciate Gustavo's effort, because writing in English can be very difficult for us if we are not coming from a tradition of writing in English. It has different structure. It's not only the language, the way that you write in English is completely different. The way that you have to set your mind, and like the hidden book that Gustavo was saying, that you have another set of a vision of the book, but it's necessary, because otherwise we are, I don't want to say stuck, but we are stuck with only a Spanish writer reading public. And I'm sorry to say that even though Spanish can be a very beautiful language, it's not the main language where historiography is being made. And if you're not writing in English, and I know that by a fact, you are not being read. So I appreciate Gustavo's example in that sense.
Thank you, Valeria and Sandra also. I would like to give the stage to Florinda, and I will finalize with a question myself.
Okay, I enjoyed very much everything that was said here. I want to address one of the things that Rosalie said about the non-validity, as it were, of the division north-south and the methodology it implies. The problem is that the methodology that was built on the north-south difference, okay, it's not valid anymore, but it hasn't yet been replaced by a valid set of concepts of instruments for research and so on. Because saying that the division is no longer valid or no longer completely valid, I'm sure it is in some aspects, is another way of saying that the reality is hybrid. And hybridity is very hard to be conceptually addressed, because we get lost very easily. Many things around this idea have been said here. I just want to mention a field that I have been working on in which this happens, and I experienced that. I've been working with Latin American writers in the States who are also Jewish. This crossing of two different identities that for the States are both something different. allo the identities. And I found the difficulties in that arise from how you deal with this kind of phenomenon, which is very, very interesting. But I have discovered recently, I just mentioned it, it's almost curious that, reality goes faster than our intellectual processes. And there is an organization in the United States, an institution that it's called JUTINA, which means Jewish and Latina, and tries to unite and conglomerate, not in literature, but in real life, in activities and socializing people that share those two origins. So still the questions are open, and there's still a lot of work to do. And I'm sure everything that has been said here, and also Gustavo's book, which I haven't read, are a contribution to trying to create new methods out of hybridity too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florinda. I would like to finish with a question that will maybe allow you to give like a global perspective on your book and answer a contemporary question. Your book spans more or less between it's starting from the 30s and until 78. So I would like first to know why, if you could clarify why 78. Second, you do not mention the Palestinian community in Chile, and I would like to ask you how do you see it as a counterpart regarding the Jewish community? How did it maybe did it have I don't know, a mirroring effect regarding this community? If I understand right, the Palestinian community in Chile is one of the biggest ones, and it has an interesting status, class status, and bringing all this to the present. So if you could tell us maybe regarding the actual government in Chile, how is the situation towards the Jewish community?
Thank you for your question, Cynthia, and thank you very much for organizing this meeting. Why from 1932 to 1978? The idea was to trace the evolutions, the changes and the continuities of the Chilean right-wing attitudes toward youth from the 30s, when they were, at that point, I haven't coined the term respectable undesirables. For me, they were undesirables only, okay? To the end of Pinochet regime. I stopped originally in three moments. The 30s, the government of 32 to 38, the government of Arturo Alessandri. Then from 58 to 74, the government of Jorge Alessandri, the son of Arturo Alessandri, another right-wing government. And finally, on the Pinochet regime, the 17 years of the regime. I noticed that over researching, I noticed that I needed to expand the time span in the 30s to 40, 41, because in 39, so many Jews came. I could not leave that outside, so I had to include it. And then I came to realize that the years of Frey, but especially the years of Allende, were crucial to understand how crystallized these new attitudes toward Jews during the Pinochet years. So I had to make some changes to include it. If I include these, two administrations, Frey and Allende, it was very difficult to reach 1990 in 8 or 9 semesters. Because Tel Aviv University, the Israeli universities, is not like here in Germany that, the people can do PhDs forever, like 6, 7, 8 years with a scholarship. In Israel, it's not like that,
Well,
So
Cynthia knows that. Cynthia knows that.
Yeah, I'm
Actually,
sure.
I took at least 7 years, so I'm not so sure. It wasn't just...
For me, it was at the end of the fourth year, I had a daughter, they gave me one more semester. And Professor Rein, who is here, is very emphatic. When time is over, it's time to submit a paper, a dissertation. That's the main reason, a lack of time on the one hand, and the need to include parts that were not originally thought about in my research project. That's the main issue. And also, why I jumped the Holocaust years? Why did I not speak about the Jews from 41 to 45? Because that's a lot of bibliography. That's another discussion. So I thought strategically, I'm going to hopefully write about the Holocaust in the future, okay? But now it's, I would not be able to finish a dissertation that long, or I would have to do it from 32 or 33 to 45, like so many dissertations have done in other countries, okay? So it was a bid in this regard, a methodological bid. And I'm happy with the result of the exercise. I know we are running out of time. And similarly, why not? I went deep on Palestinians for similar reasons. It's a complete different set of questions, bibliography. When a Chilean right-winger, middle class, non-Jewish, non-Arab, non-German, nothing, a common Chilean, an average Chilean, have these fantasies about the Jews and the control of the war, the control of the bank. I'm not sure that the devices, the methodological devices, the question to grasp that phenomenon is the same of the Palestinians who have relatives, in Bethlehem. It cannot be the same. From my perspective, it cannot be the same. And also, the Palestinians, I talk about this with my colleague, Gabbay Rubinstein, who wrote a dissertation about the Palestinian Chilean under the supervision of Professor Rein as well. There are so many sources which are in Hebrew also, and I don't read very well Hebrew, to be honest, so it was very challenging. And I don't feel well prepared to assess that question, at least for now. And lastly, there are, I think, some misconceptions about Palestinians in Israel. First and foremost is the size of the community. I've read sources which speak about 500,000 of Palestinians. I've never seen such an amount of Palestinians in Chile, to be honest. How involved, how engaged are these Palestinian descendants in the conflict, in politics, in anti-Semitism? I don't see that very strong phenomenon, at least in the period which I researched. Today is different, okay? And finally, to your question today, yes, this is the question that happens, especially when ugly things like what is going on now in Gaza, what happened in October 7 in Israel, and the like. I understand that other questions become urgent. Okay, and I'm aware of that, and my work, which is about other things, I know the limits of my research and the limits of the responses that I can provide or propose to those questions. I would say that this change in the axis of between the left and the right, which is typically talked about or discussed in the American media, for instance, that the left is not anti-Semitic, the right is not anti-Semitic anymore, the left is anti-Semitic because it criticizes Israel and the like. Yes, that happens also in Chile. But it's very, very important to know that it's a recent development. I'm writing recently, now, these days, about President Allende and the Jews, and he had so many displays of friendliness toward Jews and toward the state of Israel, okay? So that changes, especially after the coup d'etat, the dictatorship. What did the Chilean leftists see, Jews and non-Jews alike? They saw that Israel was a close ally of Pinochet. It's very difficult that that phenomenon does not impact the perception of Jews, okay? So, but it's always about Israel. It's not about the ethnicity of Jews. Sometimes it's about the occupations, but that's the main issue. But again, I have researched only up to 1990. Now I'm writing something about when Pinochet was detained in London and the Holocaust survivors defended him. That I think that is fascinating. But again, that's a completely another story. I sincerely don't feel, prepared enough to respond your question about today Chile, President Boric, the left. I'm sorry, I cannot.
Yeah, it's totally legitimate. So if we don't have an urgent question or commentary, I think we will close here our meeting. Thank you so much, Gustavo, Raanan, and Valeria. It was really interesting. I will send you the record of this meeting. I wish you a nice 2024 beginning and hopefully better than the last one. So see you.
Thank you,
on
Cynthia.
January 15. Thank you.
Chao, muchas gracias a todos.
Gracias a
Muy bien,
ustedes.
muchas gracias.
Venga.